Madam President, I listened both to Senator Wyden and to Senator Blunt's remarks, both very thoughtful individuals, thoughtful senators, both of whom I enjoy working with. Madam President, first I ask unanimous consent that Greg Grubel of my staff be granted floor privileges for the duration of today's proceedings.
Without objection.
So, Madam President, why are Republicans refusing to agree to raise the debt ceiling? Something that we've done 89 times since the 1930s, including 18 times under President Reagan. 18 times under President Reagan. When I might point out that the Republicans controlled the White House and the Senate, and the Democrats controlled the House. Also, in September of 1987, President Ronald Reagan used his weekly radio address to urge Congress to increase the debt ceiling. He said, and here it is, I thought it was worth printing out. Here is the exact words of Ronald Reagan spoken in September of 1987. Unfortunately, Congress consistently brings the government to the edge of default before facing its responsibility. This brinkmanship threatens the holders of government bonds and those who rely on Social Security and veterans' benefits. Interest rates would skyrocket, instability would occur in financial markets, and the federal deficit would soar. The United States has a special responsibility to itself and to the world to meet its obligations. President Reagan went on, I didn't put it on here, it said, it means that we have a well-earned reputation for reliability and credibility, two things that set us apart from much of the world. Ronald Reagan said that. Well, today, so many of our friends on the other side, the Republicans, they constantly invoke Ronald Reagan as a role model, almost a kind of a patron saint. I wish they would heed his words and what he said in September of 1987. I would also remind my colleagues that when President Reagan realized that his 1981 tax cuts were resulting in large deficits, President Reagan turned right around and supported corrective income tax increases in 1982 and 1984. That's right. President Reagan supported income tax increases in 1982 and 1984. In stark contrast to President Reagan's example, today's Republicans reject any compromise that requires raising any new revenues from the wealthy. Now, one of the things we're basically talking about is eliminating tax expenditures. Those are special interest tax breaks that even Senator Coburn on the Republican side described as, quote, corporate welfare, end quote. As the distinguished chair of the Budget Committee said in his remarks earlier today, he pointed out that Senator Conrad pointed out that tax expenditures now total more than $1 trillion, more than all of our discretionary appropriations in the federal budget. Well, now here's the difference. The discretionary appropriations, for the most part, go out for things like health and education and research, transportation, security, police, the judiciary. It goes out for that. What do tax expenditures go out for? It goes out to support the wealthy. And here's why I say that. The wealthiest 1% of Americans get 26% of the benefits from these tax expenditures. That's what Senator Conrad pointed out this morning. So, Madam President, many of our Republican friends are perfectly willing, indeed eager, to slash Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, education, other programs that undergird the middle class. But they've made it clear they would rather default on the debt than agree to a compromise that requires shared sacrifice from the most privileged people in this country. The legislation before us, which is called Cut, Cap, and Balance, and which should be more fairly described, as Senator Conrad and others have said, as Cut, Cap, and Kill Medicare, it would enshrine, this bill that's before us now, would enshrine in the Constitution a requirement that it would require 2/3 vote to raise revenues. 51% could cut anything, could cut spending, but it would take 2/3 to raise any revenues. Now, what does that mean? It means as a practical matter, that it would permanently lock in the benefits of the current tax breaks for the wealthy, like the outrageous 15% tax rate for hedge fund billionaires. And by building a firewall to protect tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans, this legislation would shift even more of the burden of deficit reduction onto the backs of middle-class Americans. So again, it should be titled Cut, Cap, and Kill Medicare. That's what it's all about. Now, let me take this a step further. Now, in this bill before us that was passed over here from the House, it would cap federal expenditures at 18% of GDP, 18%. Now, where'd they get that number? Is that just an arbitrary number? Why isn't it 18.5? Why isn't it 19? Why is it 18? Well, I'll tell you why. That number has a purpose. The last time federal spending was at 18% of GDP was 1966, right before Medicare kicked in and started expanding. So guess what? They want to roll it back to a point in time before we had Medicare. Well, this assault now on Medicare comes on the heels of another Republican assault on Medicare. You may remember the Republican budget, the so-called Ryan budget. What was its centerpiece? A plan to dismantle Medicare, replace it with a voucher system that would require seniors to spend $6,400 additional money out of pocket for Medicare every year. It was basically dismantling of Medicare, turning it into a voucher system. That was the Republican budget. Well, so now we kind of have a two-front assault on Medicare by the Republicans. One is the Ryan budget, a kind of a frontal assault, if you will, to dismantle it, turn it into a voucher system. And now we have this balanced budget so-called amendment that takes an indirect backdoor approach. It would simply defund Medicare. It would put the federal government in a fiscal straitjacket, allowed to spend no more than what we did in the mid-1960s before Medicare started. That's why it's at 18%. Now, I would also say that this legislation before us is also a direct assault on Social Security, the bedrock of our American retirement system, vitally important to the middle class of America. Ensure that seniors are able to enjoy their retirement years without falling into poverty or moving in with their kids. Social Security's modest benefit, around $14,000 a year, now has become the biggest source of retirement for 2 out of every 3 adult Americans, retired Americans. So,
would the senator yield for just a moment?
I'd be glad to yield to my friend.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm late. I wanted to share the floor with the chairman of the Health Committee. Madam President, thank you. I heard what you were saying about Medicare, and it just seemed, am I right about this? I mean, I know what some conservative politicians in this town think about Medicare, because you've been through the discussions when they've, when Medicare, well, you weren't here then, of course, but in 1965 when Medicare passed, it was a lot of conservative Republicans that opposed it. Mm-hmm. And the first chance, I was in the House then, you were in the Senate, but the first chance that Speaker Gingrich, with a new Republican majority, had in the mid-90s, they tried to privatize. Remember, Speaker Gingrich talked about it withering on the vine. So am I right here that they tried this Ryan budget, the Republican budget, they tried to privatize Medicare again. Right. The public so rose up against it a few months ago. Is this sort of a backdoor way of going after Medicare? They don't want to acknowledge to their constituents they don't like Medicare, because 90-some% of Americans like Medicare and benefit from it. Is this sort of a backdoor approach to put these limits on spending so it will sort of force the privatization and the unraveling of Medicare and ultimately Social Security and these programs we care about?
Well, I think my friend from Ohio has put his finger on it. Of course it is. It's a backdoor approach because we all want to balance the budget, right? We all want to have surpluses. We don't want to have deficit spending. So it sounds good. We're going to balance the budget. And so most people say, well, that's a good idea. Let's do that. without looking behind this cap that they put in there of this 18%. 18% is a number picked by the Republicans because that would take us back to where we were in 1966 before Medicare kicked in. So it would throttle a backdoor approach as a way of defunding Medicare and also as a way of getting at Social Security, of moving it to privatization, which the Republicans have never given up on. They started under Gingrich, my friend is right. I can remember them talking about privatizing Social Security. They've never given up on that. They can't do it frontally.
Imagine,
but they're trying to do it through the back door.
Senator Harkin, if I could yield again, imagine what would have happened if in 2003 and 4, when you in the Senate with a lot of people, including a lot of Republicans all over the country, just not elected Republicans, if they had, when we were fighting the privatization of Social Security in 2005, 2004, 2005, right. Imagine what would have happened if so much of Social Security had been turned over to Wall Street. I mean, just imagine what would have happened if in 2005, all people would have put all this money in Wall Street instead of in their secure, lockboxed, if you will, Medicare, Social Security fund, where nobody's missing Social Security payments. People know what they're going to get. It's predictable. It's always there. It always will be. We put it in these private accounts, and there goes the predictability, and there goes the solidness of Social Security, right?
Well, another thing we got to think about, I say to Senator Brown, is this, that what the Republicans are saying, there's a lot of Republicans who don't care if we default. They don't care if we default. In fact, Michelle Bachmann, Congresswoman Bachmann, who is one of their front runners for the presidency, said she would never vote to increase the debt ceiling no matter what circumstance, under any circumstances. Well, as President Reagan said in 1987, it would mean that those who rely on Social Security and veterans benefits wouldn't get their Social Security checks, and that's exactly right. People have to think about this. If we default, that means that all the people who have put their money into Social Security in the past, what we're saying is, you may have put your money in there, and guess what? We're not going to pay you. Is that what we want to do as a country? Social Security is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government, more than anything in Wall Street's ever gotten. Wall Street can go under. You're right. If we had put that Social Security into the stock market, it would be in the toilet now. But we put it into U.S. government bonds because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. And that's why we have to support Social Security. That's why we can't support this cockamamie scheme of theirs that they're trying to do here. I thank my friend from Ohio for pointing those things out. It really is a backdoor assault on Medicare and on Social Security. Now, people are saying about, well, Social Security, we've got to shore up Social Security. Well, it's sound for about the next 20-some years. But looking ahead, yes, we should shore up Social Security. And one good way to do it is to raise the cap on Social Security taxes. Well, right now, the cap is $106,800 a year. What does that mean? That means if you make up to $106,000 a year, you pay into Social Security on every dollar that you earn. If you make over that, you don't. Well, let me put it another way. If you make $50,000 a year, you pay on every dollar you earn into Social Security. If you make $500,000 a year, you only pay on every 20 cents of every dollar you earn into Social Security. Why is that fair? Why is that fair that someone who makes $50,000 a year pays on every dime they earn, every dollar they earn, but someone who makes $500,000 a year only pays on 20 cents on the dollar? You want to shore up Social Security? Raise the cap on payroll taxes. Raise the cap. And that's something that no one's talking about. What are they talking about? Cut benefits. Cut the benefits. Well, we don't have to cut Social Security benefits. In no way. We just have to make it fairer in terms of how we raise the payroll taxes. As I said earlier, the bill before us would require a 2/3 vote before we could even change that. So if we wanted to raise the cap on payroll taxes on Social Security, it would require a 2/3 vote. That means we'd never get it done. That means that, yes, then at some point we'd probably have to start reducing Social Security benefits. So again, as the senator from Ohio pointed out, this is a backdoor approach to dismantling Social Security. Well, Mr. President, the Republicans are rejecting any notion of shared sacrifice. They demand that we dismantle Medicare, slash Social Security, slash education, cut infrastructure, all those things that undergird the middle class. They shred the safety net for the most vulnerable people in our society, as Senator Wyden pointed out earlier. But they insist on shielding the wealthiest people in our society from even contributing $1 to the mess that we're in. Well, lastly, Mr. President, why are so many people here, to pick up on what Senator Wyden said earlier, why are so many people here so obsessed with deficit reduction to the exclusion of the single largest priority we should have in this country, putting people back to work? That's the most urgent deficit that we have, is the jobs deficit. Senator Wyden spoke eloquently about that. Now, my friend from Missouri, Senator Blunt, talked about that too. He talked about private sector employment. Well, something's got to happen to get that moving. It's not giving more tax breaks to the wealthy. That old trickle-down theory, we tried that, never worked. Never worked. All these big tax cuts that we gave to the wealthy, that happened under George Bush and a Republican Congress. And look what the mess it got us into. We've been losing jobs for the last several years, going overseas with our jobs, put us in a huge budget deficit. I would say that one of the things we need to do now is not to turn a chainsaw on ourselves, but to recognize that the federal government can be a powerful force for stimulating the private sector. Again, one of the things that I think we need to do is to put more money in the infrastructure of this country. We need to rebuild our roads and our highways, our bridges, our sewer and water systems. We've got hundreds of billions of dollars needed to remodel and upgrade our schools all over America. We need a new electric grid, a smart grid. We need to be putting more into green energy. And energy so we won't be importing so much oil into this country. There's only one place that has the power to focus on that in a large, comprehensive way, and that's the federal government. But then people say, well, we can't do that. We can't afford it. We don't have any money. Well, they're right. So there's two ways that we can get these wheels of our economy going again. We can either borrow the money or we can raise the revenue. I would prefer we raise the revenue. There's plenty of it out there. The businesses in America are sitting on over, I've heard anywhere from $1 trillion to $2 trillion that they're not investing. Well, if they're not investing it, I know where to invest it. Let's put it out there, rebuilding the infrastructure of America. Now, that's not the government doing the work. It's simply the government providing the input so that the private sector can go to work. It's not the government. There's not government workers out there that would be building the roads and bridges and highways, that would be remodeling in our schools or building the new electric grid. No, this is the private sector doing it. But we can marshal the forces from the federal government, marshal the power to focus the funds in that direction, to rebuild America, to make it a more energy efficient, a better educated, a more innovative, technologically competent future for our kids and grandkids. And then once we started doing that, then other elements of the private sector will take off, because they will see that we have made a commitment to the future, a commitment to the future, growth of this country, growth, not a dismantling, not a withdrawing, not a shrinking, but as Senator Wyden said, a growth. And once the private sector sees that we have made a national commitment to growth, they'll start investing. How many times do we have to learn that the investment that we've made in infrastructure has spun off into all kinds of private sector entrepreneurship and jobs and new businesses? Or research, the money we put into research and how that stimulates the private sector. Mr. President, how many times have you heard this old Republican line? I hear it all the time. The government doesn't create wealth, it consumes wealth. The government doesn't create wealth, it consumes wealth. I hear that all the time. Well, that's nonsense. Now, just about a month ago or so, Mr. President, I had a hearing before my committee. My committee, the Help Committee, has jurisdiction over the National Institutes of Health. We had the National Institutes of Health in, Francis Collins, who's now the director of it, bringing us up to date on what the NIH was doing. He pointed out something very interesting. Some 20 years ago, we began to invest taxpayer money, your money, taxpayers' dollars, into something called mapping and sequencing the human gene, the Human Genome Project. It became the Human Genome Institute at the NIH. And they began about a 12-year, actually they finished it in about 12 years, process of mapping and sequencing the entire human genome. The Battelle Institute, a research institute, privately owned, not government, based, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in Ohio, did a study of this, to what happened because of that. We invested $3.8 billion in mapping and sequencing the human gene, $3.8 billion. The Battelle Institute said in the last 8 to 10 years, that $3.8 billion of taxpayer money invested in research resulted in over $790 billion of private sector investment. $3.8 billion of taxpayer money, $790 billion of private sector investment. Tell me again that the government can't create wealth? Of course it can, because it can marshal the kind of resources that this sector or that sector or that sector can't do. No private entity could have mapped and sequenced the human genome. Oh, they probably could have, but it would have taken 40 or 50 years to do it. It took the massive power of the federal government to get it done in a short period of time. So again, this is what we ought to be thinking about. How do we create jobs? How do we put people back to work? And I say it's by making sure that we have the revenue that we can to invest. We can invest in our infrastructure. And I don't mean just the physical infrastructure. I mean also the human infrastructure. That means education, job training. Mr. President, I just saw a figure the other day. This year, we are spending, of taxpayers' money, we're spending $14 billion this year training Iraqi and Afghanistani security forces. Training. $14 billion this year. Yet here in America, for all of our job training and retraining programs for the entire country, all job training programs, we're spending less than $10 billion. You think the American people think that's wise? But they don't know this. $14 billion in Iraq and Afghanistan to train their security forces, less than $10 billion to retrain our workforce for the jobs of the future. Well, Mr. President, I see others have come on the floor. I'll wrap this up. Deficit reduction is important. I'm not saying it isn't. But it is not the single most important thing right now. The single most important thing is to put people back to work. That will, as Senator White said earlier, start to create the demand. It will spur more private investment as the federal government begins to invest in the future of this country. That's where we got to be focusing it. Once we get the wheels going again, once we get people back to work and the economy starts to grow, that's when we start to reduce the deficit. To just focus on deficit reduction right now, to the exclusion of putting people back to work, reminds me of when doctors used to put leeches on people who were ill. It only made them more ill because it drained more blood out of their system, and most times proved fatal, as it did to our first president, George Washington. Our urgent, number one priority must be to create jobs and put people back to work. We shouldn't just turn a chainsaw on ourselves. I look at this Republican cut, cap, and kill Medicare proposal we have before us, and what I see is a budget predicated on fatalism and fear of the future. We need a budget that is predicated on hope and aspirations and putting our people back to work. So put the ideology aside, come together in a spirit of compromise for the good of this country to have a balanced package, a balanced spending cuts that will take place in the mid and outer ranges of our years, revenue increases now so that we can take that money and start putting people back to work, rebuilding both the human infrastructure and the physical infrastructure of this country. Mr. President, I yield the floor.